Guys, welcome back to Rodder's Garage. As you can tell, I'm back on the 48 Chevy here today, and I just took care of all that re-welding on the rear axle suspension components. As we saw in the first video, the welding was a little below par back here, so I went ahead, pulled the fuel tank because it was super easy. There's not even a filler neck on it. It just goes up under the bed. Dropped the tank, got it out of my way just to make more room and for safety reasons. I really didn't know what the top of the tank looked like and didn't really want to be blowing sparks on the top of a tank that I basically had no idea if there was any open holes on it or anything. So the tank went out, did all my welding, put the tank back in. Let's take a look at this stuff real quick. Yeah, so in that first inspection video, I was looking at all the welds back here, and they really didn't look the greatest. A lot of pitting and porosity in them. I went ahead and took my time, went about 3/4 at a time, and re-welded all the brackets. Did the airbag brackets again, got weld on the inside of the brackets. They didn't put any in there, and actually these were kind of just stitched on with basically 4 1-inch welds previously. So re-welded all the important bracketry back here, threw some satin black on it, which is still currently drying. Up on the front, I went ahead and tightened all the jam nuts that were never tightened. Those were basically I could turn them with my fingers. They were all loose. Tightened all the jam nuts on those, and on these bolts, I don't know, I'm assuming those are the bolts that came with the kit. There's some weird button Allen head deals. Their nylocks were a little bit too long, and the nylock is barely just engaging on the last thread on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on 6 of them. The top ones up by the frame here, those actually had the right half nut on them, nylock, so those were good to go. Regardless, I went ahead and backed all the nuts off on this stuff. Put a little dab of Loctite on all of them, torqued them back down. They were all pretty loose too. Got everything snugged up, and the rear suspension should be good to go. And now it's basically time to move on to the front end. All right, so I left off in the last video completing the front cradle install, the Speedway front cradle. Got my motor mount installed in here, and I told you guys I was going to install the engine off camera. Well, it's done. As you can see here from the bottom, exhaust is back on. New transmission lines, new fuel lines from basically the rear axle forward because they looked terrible previously and were not secured or mounted to anything. So now I have the rubberized clips self-tapped in the rail. The fuel line's no longer rubbing on sharp edges. All that stuff's taken care of. It took me about, I don't know, a day and a half to get the engine back in this thing. I threw intake gaskets in it, swapped out some headers for some stainless ones, just a bunch of stuff that I didn't feel was really worth filming on this project. Anyway, basically this thing should start up and run right now. So I've got the rack back in, and I am basically ready to start building some airbag bracket parts. Over on the other end of the shop, I've got all my parts painted. I did this over the weekend, came in, prepped everything up, taped off all my bushings. I peeled the tape off this morning, as you can see. Got everything painted with 3 coats of satin black here, and everything is ready to start assembling. So I am going to go ahead and let this thing down just a little bit because it's a little too high for me to start installing parts up there. Get this thing down to a reasonable height. That should be pretty good. Get it back on the locks. And I'm going to go ahead and start installing my upper and lower control arms and spindles on this thing so I can start measuring out for some airbag mounting parts. Get this stuff all bolted on here tonight. And then in the morning, try to do some math and make up some brackets for these bags. All right, guys, well, it is time to start mounting some airbags in the front of this kit here. And basically, I want to point one thing out to you guys before I get going on this. You might be wondering, why did I buy this style lower control arm? You see, this style lower control arm is actually for a coil spring. This is a coil spring Mustang II setup here. Right now, I could basically put a coil right in here, shock up the center, and be good to go and eliminate the air ride. Speedway also offers a lower control arm that is set up for airbags. I could have bolted the airbag right off to their style lower control arm, but I chose to go this way because we had actually discussed if in the future the airbags or the air ride doesn't really work out for them, about being able to put a coil spring back in it and get rid of the air system completely. So I opted to order the coil spring style lower control arm, and what I am going to do is basically make my own custom lower mount to come up and cup this spring centering stanchion here on the bottom of this lower control arm for the coil spring, and I am basically going to mount my airbag pretty much like this up on top of it and retain all of that, because in the future, if the air ride doesn't work out for them, you can just unbolt the bag right out of here, unbolt the bracket off the lower, and throw a coil spring in here and totally eliminate the air system, at least on the front of it. And if a guy really wanted, you could throw some coilovers in the back. It's already set up with the 4-link, and completely eliminate the air ride on this thing. So that is why I chose that style lower control arm. This is the original upper mount that they used in that other Mustang setup. You can see here on the side, there's a hole. That's where the air line actually comes out of it. Basically, the way they had it set up, they have a 90-degree there on the side, and the line comes in the backside through that hole and plugs into that 90. On my new bags, I actually would like to run a hard line out the back towards the chassis, 90 it in hard line, and maybe even come through the back of this to get my compression connection here on the back side of this, where the hose comes in, where the plastic tube comes in for the air system. And that is because, well, basically, if it ever blows out or something happens, you can get to it instead of having to unbolt the spring cup and all that stuff and drop it down to get to that 90. Basically what I'm saying is I don't like it locked inside of this cup where you can't easily get to that on the road if something were to happen. So I'm going to come up with a plan for that. The other thing is, these were the original uppers, and basically they fit in the old kit exactly the same as this kit. You can see here that I'm like a 1/2 inch inboard from the outside of the spring cup here. I'm actually going to cut these ones up, and I'm going to use these on the bottom because guess what? They basically cup right around all the stamping in this lower control arm for where the coil spring should sit. That cups it perfectly. So I'm going to cut these down, use these for the lowers, and I'm going to make some new uppers out of this heavy wall 1/4 inch, 5-inch pipe. Basically the same pipe I used to do my C-notches in the chassis, because that one, as you can see, fits up nice and tight here to the outside of the spring hat on the top. And basically that's what I've figured out so far. So I'm going to start making a bunch of parts here. Let's get these bags and get them plumbed up and see how many pounds it takes to hold this thing at ride height. Let's get going. Alright guys, well I wrapped up painting my mounts for the airbags last night, and then I ran to town afterwards and picked up some more plumbing hardware for doing the new bags. I got myself a brand new all brass compression or quick connect fitting here, and basically it's going to be hard lined right out the back of the buckets. I should have about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches of clearance from this elbow to the frame once this is in that upper spring mount on the truck over there. So that way, at least if you blow a line or something, you can easily just jack the truck up or crawl under it and get to this fitting to replace any plastic line if there's ever an issue on the road. So I'm gonna go ahead and put all this stuff together, get the cups bolted on the new airbags, finish up sealing these pipes and threads on this new stuff here. We're gonna go throw it in the truck, hook up the air lines, and throw the battery back in this thing and run that air compressor up and see how many pounds it takes to get this thing sitting at ride height. Nice. All right, well this is side one all put together, and basically at this point I put on my caliper bracket and my tie rod, obviously measured out equal distances on both sides for the tie rods, just so it's closer when it comes time for alignment. And I know everything's pretty much centered. So basically I got this side together, everything's bolted in and ready to go. And if I turn this all the way to the lock or till it stops, basically it's hitting the control arm at that point. No, maybe it's not. It just bottomed out in the rack. It's very close to the sway bar link. But anyway, gonna have plenty of clearance. Not gonna become anywhere near the airbag. Same this way. Caliper should have a mile of clearance there. Spindle, definitely a lot of room between the bag and there. I'd say this setup is gonna work out great. Other thing on the back side. You saw me drilling those holes earlier back here. That is where the air line is going to go through. And as you can see, my quick connect lines right up with that, and plenty of room to the chassis down here on the bottom. I'd say there's a good 1/4 inch of clearance to that fitting. Now, just for safety, I actually had the thought in my head that potentially this bag could turn over time if things got loose. The top bolt up here, and I'll show you guys this in a minute on the other side before I put it together. The top nut up here just is that one bolt welded on up. It's a fine thread 1/2 inch. This is just a shoulder lug nut with a washer on top, pretty much engaging in the shock hole, and that's what's holding the top centered. On the bottom, I made myself a big plate, kind of put it in here with a crush tube inside. I'll show you on that side in a minute once more. Bolted that on with a 1/2 inch nut. Now, there is the potential over time that this bag could turn. It could turn over time if the nuts loosen up a little bit on those 2 center bolts, or just in general, as the suspension works, it might turn one way or another. And I had that in mind with that fitting so close to the rail. I mean, a 1/4 inch is good, but if it turns, it's gonna hit the rail and potentially could break it off. So what I did was, earlier, I welded those tabs on the lower buckets here, 1 tab on each side, 5/16 grade 8 bolt that I drilled a hole right through the control arm and down through my new washer plate on the bottom and bolted that tight. So that eliminates the possibility of anything ever turning. So that tube pipe back here, that hard line should never move from where it's at right now. So let's run to the other side. I will show you the hardware real quick before I put it together. All right, so before I roll that top bolt in, that's all that is a long shoulder lug nut. 1/2 inch fine thread. That's what indicates the top and holds the top cup in place. And on the bottom, there's my big washer. Same washer as on the other side, and I made a crush sleeve that goes up the bolt here, and it is about a 1/16, 32nd 16th short of the plate on the bottom. So when I tighten up my bottom nut on the bottom washer plate, it will crush just a little bit, but not crush that 3/16 washer plate into this hole down here. If I didn't have this in here and I cranked it down like that, and over time, as the thing traveled down the road and bounced, there is the potential for it to actually start bending that 3/16 plate a little bit. And as it bends, basically the nut's gonna come loose and has the potential for rolling off the bottom. So a crush sleeve is always a good way to go when you're doing stuff like that. Let me throw this side together. I'm gonna get some rotors on this thing. I already have the bearings packed. Get the rotors on, calipers, make sure the caliper is clear, and then it's time to throw some tires on here, hook up the air lines, and let's see where that pressure is at ride height. All right, well, looks all right. Get some air going. Pounds. I don't have shocks on it yet, which is going to take care of this, but that's going to ride really nice. Got my control arms just a little below level right now. It looks great. It feels great. So yeah, if we look at the gauge here, the green needles are the front bags. I've got about 22 pounds in the rear right now, and 84-ish in the front bags. From the original 140 that it took with the little bags on the old setup, I am now at 80. So that's 60 pounds, 60 pounds less than it took before to get up the ride height, and everything looks really great under here. I got it at 85. Lower control arms are just a little bit below level. That should work out pretty good. The bags look great. Way better than when this thing originally came in here and they were all messed up and squished looking and stuff. I basically set them up so at a ride height with the lower control arms roughly level that the bag would be in line and somewhat true. So those are actually looking really good. We'll start off on the steering column tomorrow, get the steering all figured out and get the shocks mounted, and I'll take it for an alignment off camera and we'll go take this thing for a cruise. And I'm betting that it's going to drive a lot nicer than it did before. I'm excited. Guys, so I left off on the video, for me, probably about a week and a half ago. Wrapped up the shocks and started putting on the front brake hoses, and as you can see, the 48 is now parked by the door, aired up, sitting at ride height, and it's basically ready to go. Yeah, after I got the brake hoses on, I decided to just breeze through the rest of this stuff off camera. The rest of it was pretty boring anyway. Basically got all the front brake lines, ran up to the master, had to run a new line from the master or proportioning valve back down to the rear, bled all the brakes, ran all the new fuel lines, got the fuel pump changed out, and basically just wrapped up all the mechanical stuff to make this thing run and drive. I did have to mess with the steering column a little bit too, and one of the biggest reasons I had to do that, well, first of all, I had to lower it on the firewall and under the dash a little just to get my steering to line up correctly. The other thing was they really didn't plate or reinforce anything behind the booster here when attaching that to the firewall. So the first time I took it for a ride with the column lowered in the truck, basically every time I hit a bump in this thing, the steering wheel was flopping all over the place violently. Basically their bracketry wasn't strong enough for the column mount itself or for the booster. And another thing that was happening was every time I hit a bump, the booster was flopping around all over the place. It's still, I don't even know if you guys can see that. The thing moves around pretty good, put it that way. So basically every time I hit a bump, I was hearing that vibrate up through the firewall and the steering wheel was violently shaking. It was pretty bad. So I made a set of new mounts to mount the column off to the bottom of the dash. The column does not move anymore. That moves about half as much as it used to. That really should have been plated on the firewall, but it should be okay to go now. I also took this thing for an alignment. Brought it over to a buddy's shop. He helped me out, did me a favor, got the thing all aligned, and I test drove it, and everything seems good to go now. My final air pressure in the bags in the front is pretty much 100 pounds. 100 pounds in the front bag sets this thing up perfectly. It drives nice. It's a little stiff in town. The roads are pretty bad around here. But if you get out on the highway and start cruising 60, 70 miles an hour, this thing really rides nice. It is a huge difference compared to when I first picked the thing up to bring it down here and inspect it. So basically at this point, I'm gonna try to close the hood properly. Scoot it up again. Basically at this point, that's it. I'm ready to call the customer so he can come pick the thing up. But before I do that, let me take you guys for one more ride in the thing. I'll put on another 5-6 miles in it, make sure everything's good to go. And that's pretty much gonna wrap it up on this one. Well guys, that pretty much wraps up the 48 suspension redo with the air ride. It's a lot better than what it used to be. It is a little rough in town with 100 100 pounds in the front end. I mean, when you hit bumps at a slow speed, it shakes a little more than, I think shakes a little more than like a coilover or coil spring setup, but it seems to me like once you get going over 40, it cruises nice. I mean, right now we're going, let's see, 65. It planes right out, man. This thing drives really, really nice. A lot better than before, and it's a lot less scary this time around too. So, and remember, the ball joints were bad. The steering was all screwed up. There was absolutely no alignment on it. 140 pounds to 150 to get it up to ride height, where now we're cruising at a steady 100. Night and day difference. So that's gonna wrap it up for the 48. Appreciate it, guys. Thanks for watching. Till next time.